I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and Coordinator of Library Lectures. We welcome today students, colleagues, and invited guests to our House of Learning lecture with Professor Tony Brown as our featured speaker. His address for us today is entitled Redefining Cultural Identities, an examination of cross-cultural perspectives from Russian and American university-age students. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lecture Series and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lecture Series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's speaker. Professor Tony Brown earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Southern Methodist University in 1998 and completed both an MA in 2002 and a PhD in Russian in 2004 from Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. Among other classes here at BYU, he teaches courses in the cultural history of Russia, as well as seminars on advanced Russian grammar. His research interests are varied and include aspects of language policy and planning, particularly as it concerns the Republic of Belarus, and Russo-American cross-cultural studies, about which we shall hear something today. In addition to his scholarship, many students know of his concern for them and for their academic success. He is a role model for them as a faithful scholar. It is with great pleasure today we welcome Professor Tony Brown.
Faculty, friends, and family, thank you for coming today. And also thank you to the Lee Library for facilitating this lecture, for inviting me to speak on this series. As you can see, the title of my remarks today is Redefining Cultural Identities, an examination of cross-cultural perspectives from Russian and American university-age students. At the height of the Cold War, a U.S. racing car easily beat a Russian car in a two-car race. How did the Russian newspapers truthfully report this in order to make it look as though the Russian car had outdone the American car? The Russian newspapers reported correctly that the American car came in next to last, while the Russian car came in second. An American newspaper covering the same event could just as easily have reported correctly that the Russian car came in second, while the American car came in first. Both statements represent valid descriptions. The critical difference, however, lies in the observer's perspective, or rather, how one might want others to perceive an event. Certainly, witnessing and experiencing an event firsthand does not necessarily result in a shared reality. Indeed, as one of William Faulkner's characters aptly reasoned, if I had been there, I couldn't have seen it this plain. One need not look far when studying the cultures of Russia and America to find intrinsic and compelling similarities. Take, for example, the expansionist spirit of both nations. Russia, in terms of extending its influence southward to the Crimea and the Ottoman Empire, but perhaps more dramatically in terms of its eastward expansion, beyond the Ural Mountains in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, that took in the deep forests of Siberia, including the Kamchatka Peninsula. America, on the other hand, pursued a westward expansion policy under the banner of Manifest Destiny, which imbued the movement with an element of divine right. Westward expansion for early American settlers likewise entailed crossing a considerable landmass, including the Rocky Mountain Range, beyond which lay the fertile regions of the Pacific Rim and the arid desert climates of the Great Salt Lake Basin. Expansionist movements on the part of both America and Russia ultimately met in 1812 in Fort Ross, California, located just north of San Francisco. Perhaps another common denominator linking the countries and cultures of Russia and America is a propensity for thinking big. Indeed, both countries have produced some of the most inventive and forward-thinking minds. Artistic and literary talent in both countries ranks among the finest in the world. And since 1993, both countries have pioneered the construction of the International Space Station, or Mir, a word that in Russian has three meanings: village commune, world, and peace. In terms of sheer landmass, the United States ranks fourth in the world with a landmass spanning 3,539,224 square miles and 5 time zones, whereas Russia ranks first overall with a landmass spanning 6,592,812 square miles and 11 time zones. James Billington, current Librarian of Congress and pioneer in the field of Russian cultural history, makes the following observation with regard to Russia and its propensity for doing things big.
The Russian theme of reaching for the stars has always fascinated me. The world's largest spaceships are still Russian, and the history of Russia has often seemed to me to consist of one great but often ill-fated crash project after another. I first discovered Russia as a schoolboy, visiting the New York World's Fair of 1939. I realized as I looked at those models of all the things they were building in the new Soviet Union that this was a country where people thought big. They thought very big indeed. There were real dams and imaginary cities like this plan for transforming the hill in the center of Kiev. Here, where Russians had first accepted Christianity, the communists blew up a historic church to make room for a vast temple to be capped by a statue of Lenin.
While one can point out a number of similarities between the two countries, one also need not look far to find intrinsic differences, not the least of which being the weight accorded individual rights. Historically, Americans have championed laws that safeguard individual rights, whereas individual rights for Russians largely have been subordinated to the greater communal good. Pluralistic thinking and the attendant challenges that accompany diverse views characterized the American culture, and to a large degree mesmerized an entire generation of young people growing up in the 1990s in Russia. Yet Russians gradually became disillusioned by what initially appeared so attractive and promising to them. Indeed, the decade of the 90s came to be characterized in Russia as a time of unpredictability, a chaotic and even violent time, a time of troubles, borrowing the term used to describe the turbulent period spanning the threshold of the 16th and 17th centuries in Russia. In many ways, though, Russia's attempt at embracing the fruits of American democratic institutional building immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union reflects a larger tendency towards seeking to acquire the end products of other civilizations without the intervening process of slow growth and inner understanding. Looking back on the 20th century, one can point out a number of unprecedented advances in science and technology that both fostered and impeded intercultural communication between Russia and the United States. Post-World War II relations between the United States and the Soviet Union became dangerously tenuous. Protecting national security interests translated into imposing severe restrictions on contact and communication between peoples of both nations. Entire master narratives arose in both countries, which illustrated just how easily misunderstandings and stereotypes could ossify, due largely to limited information and contact. While such restrictions on contact disappeared almost overnight following the collapse of the Soviet Union, overcoming long-held stereotypes and misunderstanding has proven to be an ongoing challenge. Research carried out in 2004 and 2005 by myself and two fellow colleagues at BYU, Raisa Solovyova from Germanic and Slavic languages, and Dennis Eggett from statistics, sought to foster understanding between the cultures of the United States and Russia by analyzing responses to 4 open-ended questions posed to university-age students in both countries. Specifically, 1, for you, what are the distinguishing characteristics of Russian and American culture? 2, which literary figures embody characteristics native to the Russian and American people? 3, which Russian, American historical or cultural figure most accurately represents Russian and American culture? What stands out for you as the main quality of this historical or cultural figure? So as you can see, really they responded to 8 questions. They are the same 4 questions, just pertaining to their own culture and then the corresponding culture. The participants were university students from Russia and the US and citizens of their respective countries, a total of 305. Findings reflect self-reports from 153 Russian and 152 US participants who studied at 7 institutions of higher education in Russia and 3 in the US. The research targeted students without extensive cross-cultural instruction in an effort to ascertain whether certain myths and stereotypes persist among both groups. An examination of responses to question 1 reveals a number of potential methods by which to analyze the data. Today, I will address 2 possible approaches, the first of which pertains to the issue of collective versus individual mentality. The format of the following slides that you'll see warrants a brief explanation. You'll see a number of slides with combinations of Russian and American flags. The flag to the left reflects the culture providing responses, and the flag to the right reflects the culture to which the responses pertain. In describing American culture, just over half of the responses from Russians fell into the category of individual, examples of which include egocentrism, self-perfection, and pursuit of personal welfare. Collective type responses included melting pot, absence of national roots, and naivete in understanding world processes. Conversely, almost all of the responses from Russians describing their own culture applied to the category of collective, such as character of the people, hospitality, deep roots, whereas the category of individual received disproportionately few responses, examples of which include independence and diversity. Responses from American students resemble closely those of their Russian counterparts. Describing American culture, Americans emphasized characteristics relative to the category of individual, for example, ambition, entrepreneurship, and power-driven, whereas responses associated with collective included family, loyal, and immigration. With regard to Russian culture, American respondents favored collective, examples of which included apartments, breadlines, and communism, whereas individual responses included assertive, free thinking, and socially stratified. The second approach to analyzing question 1 entails differentiating responses qualitatively according to the headings of ideology, subjective, or objective. Responses classified under the heading of ideology reflect political, economic, and/or social needs or aspirations of individuals or cultures. Subjective responses provide descriptive evaluations of an object, type, or characteristic that span from highly critical to commendable, whereas objective responses indicate a fact or artifact and do not provide additional commentary or personal evaluation of an object, type, or characteristic. Data gathered from Russian participants regarding Russian culture indicate that the category of ideology received the least number of responses, possibly suggesting that ideological considerations play a relatively insignificant role for Russian participants in characterizing their own culture. Instead, Russians overwhelmingly characterized their own culture by assigning subjective qualities to it, many of which reflect esteemed qualities such as depth, expansive, beauty, and unselfishness, in addition to less desirable qualities such as something for nothing, the Russian word being chalyava, drunkenness, and squalor. With regard to American culture, Russians likewise offered a disproportionate number of subjective responses, which included surface level, enterprising, snobism, priority-oriented, and even stupidity. The category of ideology received the second highest percentage of responses and included such examples as imposing oneself on entire world, battle for freedom, and export forces, while the category of objective received the fewest responses, examples of which included hamburger, movies, and sports. Responses from American participants regarding Russian culture reflect a similar distribution as their Russian counterparts. Examples of subjective included bad living conditions, corrupt, perseverance, respect elders, and emotional, whereas examples of objective included cupola, factories, grandmothers, and borscht. The second question sought to ascertain influential sources contributing to participants' cultural outlook. While the question calls for literary figures, only 1/3 of Russian participant responses pertaining to American culture actually applied to literary figures, of which Mark Twain's characters, specifically Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, and J.D. Salinger's heroes appeared repeatedly. Conversely, a full 99% of Russian participant responses regarding Russian literary figures applied directly to literature. American participants responding to the question of prominent American literary figures likewise favored Mark Twain, or personages thereof, as evidenced by over 1/3 of respondents citing such figures. Interestingly, 26% of Russian participant responses regarding American culture pertained to cinema, rather than printed literature. And of those responses, reference to the classic American movie Gone with the Wind occurred repeatedly. Although the movie represents a dramatized version of Margaret Mitchell's 1936 novel, participant responses likely bear reference to the movie due to its relatively recent release in Russia and highly favorable reception. Russian participants also cited such cinematic renditions of literary works as Jane Eyre, King Arthur, and Robin Hood, which, however, do not represent American literature in the first place. Similarly, American cartoon characters appeared prominently in Russian student responses as examples of significant literary figures, including such classic Disney characters as Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, as well as contemporary characters such as The Simpsons. American participants likewise supplied an array of responses that extended beyond the domain of literary personages, including notable movie stars such as John Wayne and the character roles of Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara, as well as political figures including the Founding Fathers, Martin Luther King, and presidents of the United States. In addition, Americans associated several non-American figures with American culture, including Shakespeare, Calvin, and Tolkien. Overall familiarity with literary figures among Americans appeared lacking when compared with the literary background of their Russian counterparts, possibly owing to the comparatively low number of American versus Russian participants majoring in the humanities in the sample, and or lack of literary content in American public education. One American participant perhaps unfortunately spoke for others when he responded candidly, "What is a literary figure?" Or as in the case of another participant, "I do math." Unsurprisingly, the volume of American responses to the question of prominent literary figures in Russian culture decreases further from the number cited concerning American culture. Of those authors and respective personages cited by Americans, Tolstoy appears most prominently, along with the characters from his novels including Andrei Bolkonsky, Levin, and Natasha Rostova, followed by Dostoevsky and characters from his works such as Raskolnikov, Sonya, and in general the brothers Karamazov. When responding to the question of literary figures in Russian culture, Russian participants cited Leo Tolstoy most frequently, with Andrei Bolkonsky, Natasha Rostova, and Anna Karenina representing prominent literary figures respectively. Goncharov, author of the classic Russian novel Oblomov, received the second highest percentage of responses. Pushkin received the third highest percentage of responses, followed by Dostoevsky. The literary figure of Tatyana Larina from Pushkin's novel and verse Yevgeny Onegin appeared frequently in student responses, as did the fractured figure of Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's classic novel Crime and Punishment. With respect to the question about historical or cultural figures, I will touch on responses consolidated under the headings of political, literature, and movie. In terms of American culture, Russian participants overwhelmingly identified historical figures subsumed under the broad heading of political. Presidents of the United States represent a large majority of the individual responses, especially Washington, Lincoln, Kennedy, Clinton, and George W. Bush. However, reasons for citing each figure differ widely on the spectrum of commendable versus critical. In reference to Washington and Lincoln, Russian participant responses dealt largely with moral and service qualities, such as gave independence to country, prepared for everything for the sake of happiness of loved ones and homeland, and strength of character. Similarly, Russians praised Kennedy and Clinton for their service qualities, but more particularly for their charisma, charm, and versatility of mind. Conversely, many Russian participants assigned highly critical qualities to George W. Bush, who, according to the results of the research, they perceived as embodying qualities of aggressiveness and meaningless persistence. Similar to their Russian counterparts, American participants, in connection with Russian culture, overwhelmingly cited historical figures relative to the heading of political, in particular, Stalin and Lenin. Reasons for citing Stalin included dominating, dictator, murderer, nationalism, and power hungry, to name a few. Again, these are American responses with regard to Russian culture. When comparing reasons for selecting Lenin, whom American participants cited just over half as many times as Stalin, one encounters a tone of homage and respect, as exemplified in responses such as change, revolutionary, struggle, vision, good intentions, albeit impractical. Such disparate views of Stalin and Lenin suggest that American participants perceived Lenin as a selfless leader devoted to the cause of humanity, whereas Stalin acted out of self-interest and manipulated people and institutions in order to accomplish his personal ambitions, often at the expense of humanity. In contrast to their American counterparts, only 3 Russian participants cited Stalin as a representative historical figure in Russian culture and made no mention of Lenin whatsoever. Now keep in mind that this is only a decade and a half after the fall of the Soviet Union, or the wall, when, if we could go back to that time, the late 80s, if you opened up a standard textbook, the first page that you would find would be a color, or a black and white rather, photo of Lenin. That kind of recognition and homage for their esteemed leader was ingrained in their minds from the very beginning. And now when we're looking at a generation only a decade and a half later, we see that of 132 participants, not a single one even cites Lenin as a significant historical figure. Although American participants also cited historical figures relative to the heading of political, more often than any other category, the vast majority of responses apply only to 2 individuals, Washington and Lincoln. Reasons cited for mentioning such historical figures, without exception, bear a highly commendable tone. Now again, this is Americans, about American culture. For Washington, American participants cited such qualities as belief in the destiny of man, leadership, sacrifice, hardworking, and patriotic. Similarly, participants cited qualities for Lincoln such as accepting, died a hero, fought for country, and above all, integrity. The data also indicated that Americans consider Gorbachev a representative historical figure for reasons such as perseverance, change, end Cold War, and end communism, whereas Russian participants did not cite him once. Nor did Russian participants cite Gorbachev's successor Yeltsin, whereas American participants did. Preliminary findings present a number of important implications relative to the study of cross-cultural perspectives. For example, the data suggest that the historical Russian penchant for collectivism and the traditional American preference for individualism are germane in understanding contemporary thinking and should not be dismissed as cultural myth or stereotyping. Historically speaking, the difference between Russian peasants and American farmers illustrates the contrast between Russian collectivism and American individualism. Russian peasants lived on the mir, or village commune, and banded together with others in the community to work the land, all receiving an equal share. One glaring exception to this traditional approach dates back to the early 1920s in Russia, when Lenin, in an effort to reinvigorate Russia's shattered economy, instituted what came to be known as the New Economic Policy, which encouraged private enterprise and free market economic principles. Perhaps unsurprisingly, farmers who took advantage of the somewhat liberal economic policy eventually came under heavy fire, not initially at least from government authorities, but from neighboring peasants, who resented what they perceived as a threat to the status quo. Conversely, the American farmer fenced his property and took economic risks in an effort to prosper. Hard-earned capital benefited both the individual and the economy at large, thus encouraging productivity and ingenuity. The data also indicate a strong preference for subjective cultural characterizations over objective and ideological, despite a lingering rivalry observed by Russian participants regarding their American counterparts that fosters ideological thinking and competition. Interestingly, Russian participants perceived themselves as less ideological than their American counterparts, who they characterized in terms such as aggressiveness, striving to make everybody like themselves, imposing oneself on the entire world, and intruding on other people's business. One finds in this critical view of America as representing the aggressor rather than defender a curious reversal of roles in American and Russian cultures, stemming back to 1956, Soviet invasion of Hungary, 1968, Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, 1980, Soviet invasion of Poland, 1979 through 1989, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when America regarded the Soviet Union as the aggressor, while Soviet authorities justified their actions as necessary for the defense of the rights and freedoms of people friendly towards the Soviet Union living in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Afghanistan. Perhaps less obvious, though, in terms of aggressiveness and imposing oneself on the entire world, is the perception among some Russians of Americans as aggressive exporters of foreign religious confessions. Such an idea often seems xenophobic and unduly reactionary to Americans, including young LDS missionaries. Yet isolation and exclusion also characterize the history of the Mormon Church to a certain extent. Just as Russia became isolated from Western Europe at the dawn of the Renaissance, owing largely to Mongol invaders who swept across the Russian steppe, leaving destruction in their wake, early members of the Mormon Church became isolated from family and civilization at large. When under duress, they fled across the plains of Iowa and Nebraska, and eventually settled in the distant and seemingly uninhabitable basin of the Great Salt Lake. Isolation from mob violence and religious persecution took on two forms for Mormon settlers in the Salt Lake Valley. The first being physical isolation in the form of the Rocky Mountains that separated the nascent Mormon communities from the government of the United States, while the second being cultural isolation in the sense of suspicion of and occasionally prejudice against outside influence, including outside religious influence. Although the Catholic Church had held rights to property in Salt Lake as early as the pioneer era under the leadership of Brigham Young, deep and long-held suspicion of potential usurpation of a predominantly Mormon community by the Catholic Church lingered as late as the 1950s, when a misunderstanding arose over the wording in a pamphlet published by the Catholic Church in Utah. The pamphlet, entitled "A Foreign Mission Close to Home," sparked an uproar among church leaders who mistakenly interpreted the word mission to imply proselytizing rather than a rudimentary, underfunded parish. Although relations were patched between the LDS and Catholic churches, the irony of the matter remained, namely, that just as Mormons were embracing themselves to resist what they mistakenly interpreted as an imminent onslaught of Catholic proselytizing, simultaneously, they were sending their young men and women to Catholic strongholds around the country and world to convert Catholics to Mormonism. Perhaps a sense of isolation and even xenophobia among followers of Mormonism and Russian Orthodoxy likewise stemmed from an intrinsic belief that apostasy had overtaken the Christian world. Russia inherited Eastern Orthodoxy from Byzantium in the 10th century. Christianity spread rapidly in the land of the Rus and later Muscovy, owing largely to the tireless efforts of monks who established outposts in the far reaches of Russia's deep forests and frozen wastelands. Russians traced the one true faith to Rome, but later accorded Constantinople primacy in light of what they perceived as apostasy on the part of church leaders in Rome. When Constantinople forged a union with Rome in the 15th century, thereby also falling away into apostasy in the opinion of the Russian church, Russian monks and the Muscovite princes concluded that Russia henceforth represented the sole bearer of the one true faith. In the words of Philotheus to Ivan III, 2 Romes have fallen. A third stands. A fourth there shall not be. Similarly, the very premise of Mormonism hinges on the belief of an apostasy, as prophesied by Amos and other prophets. Indeed, as Mormon history scholar Richard Bushman points out, the balance of Joseph Smith's 1835 and 1838 accounts of the first vision shifted in emphasis from that of personal forgiveness to the apostasy of the churches. The promise of forgiveness through faith in Christ was dropped from the narrative, and the apostasy of Christian churches stood as the central message of the vision. The pure and undefiled teachings of Christ, Joseph was told, would be restored at a future date. Thus, Mormonism made the bold claim of being the sole bearer of the one true faith, untainted by priestly interpretations and the philosophies of men. Russian Orthodoxy likewise continues to claim the role of bearer of the one true faith, but does not seek necessarily to convert others to the faith by means of proselytizing. By and large, one could argue that internal, rather than external forces, facilitate the spread of Russian Orthodoxy. As James Billington observed, it may be in the last analysis that Russia has been able to overcome all its suffering and extrude all foreign invaders, even including ultimately the alien ideology of Marxist communism, because of the inner strength that comes from the unspoken but widespread belief that Russia is defined at its core by the integrity of its internal life, more than by the extent of its external power. One can find this idea of organic growth taking hold from within rather than imposition from without in a Russian proverb. В чужой монастырь своим уставом не ходит. Literally translated as, they do not go to a foreign monastery with their own rules. Such a proverb finds its English language corollary in the following, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Perhaps such an inward-looking approach to conversion sheds light on a statement written by Fyodor Dostoevsky in his novel, The Possessed. A man who was not Orthodox could not be Russian. This inner strength, indeed, has sustained Russians over the centuries, both ecumenically and militarily. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Russians interpreted their defense against an invasion from Catholic Teutonic Knights in the 13th century as a military victory, but more importantly, as an outward manifestation of divine intervention on the part of God in order to preserve his chosen bearers of the one true faith. Sergei Eisenstein, in his 1938 film Alexander Nevsky, brilliantly juxtaposed the crusade-like mentality of the Catholic Church with Russian Orthodoxy and its modest mission as one of defender of the faith rather than exporter. And just as religious ideologies have competed for the Russian soul, so have political ideologies, most vividly that of Marxism, which masqueraded itself as a grassroots political philosophy when in fact its architect and leader Vladimir Lenin imposed the foreign ideology on the people at a tremendous cost in terms of human suffering and bloodshed, not to mention the collapse of the Russian economy. Yet instead of wholesale substituting the one ideology for the other, Russia held on to the old while simultaneously embracing the new, a delicate balancing act to say the least, and one that frequently led to public humiliation, exile to the infamous gulags and or execution in the dreaded headquarters of the KGB, the Lubyanka. In spite of seemingly impossible odds, Russia emerged from the Soviet era of official atheism with its roots very much still intact. Ideology-related responses from American participants center on the theme of freedom, a dominant theme in the current American presidential administration, and one that George W. Bush emphasized in his second inaugural address given in January 2005. Yet ennobling virtues associated with freedom for American participants can resonate both with positive and negative associations for Russian participants. Case in point, Russian participants' perception of the American invasion of Iraq versus their perception of the manner in which Russia has dealt with Chechnya. During the time that university students participated in this research, Russia was reeling in the aftermath of the Beslan terrorist attack, not to mention dealing with the Chechen War. Yet Russians withheld ideological criticism of themselves, as evidenced by such responses as patriotism and victory of good over evil. Such responses suggest a type of centrist or exclusionary thinking based on a perceived mandate to defend one's nation from an all-encompassing aggressive and evil world, thinking that fuels what Lotman refers to as isolationism and self-absorption in all cultural political spheres. Although subjective responses from American participants regarding Russian culture rarely call into question personal attributes or qualities, they disclose perhaps the primary standard by which Americans measure other cultures, namely that of infrastructural sophistication and development. Conversely, Russian participants frequently criticize American culture, or rather, the absence of culture, thus accentuating a particular strength relative to Russian culture, that of high culture. Each approach to measuring culture carries with it inherent flaws. The American approach in terms of external indices, not necessarily reflective of internal growth or decay, while the Russian approach in terms of refinement and talent, albeit championed by a select few. Ironically, such an approach to cross-cultural assessment contributes to each culture perceiving its counterpart as inferior. In addition, Russian participants' bold juxtaposition of both cultures in terms of depth versus surface-like suggests that Russians associate depth of cultural heritage with historical precedent, an association that affords the New World little chance of competition when compared with its Slavic counterpart. Critical assessments of American culture by Russian participants in and of themselves highlight a salient feature of Russian culture, namely a preference for direct and forthright, albeit subjective characterizations over oblique and possibly couched responses. Unsurprisingly, Russian respondents indicated spontaneity and openness as two characteristics inherent in Russian culture, whereas they cited political correctness and closed nature of people as two qualities inherent in American culture. Conversely, the types of subjective responses given by Americans about Russian culture bear substantial qualitative differences from answers given by Russian participants about American culture. Rarely do American responses call into question the character and integrity of the Russian people as a whole. Rather, they deride institutional shortcomings and corruption, such as bad schools, bad living conditions, corrupt government, and oppressed. This in stark contrast with several Russian estimations of American culture in terms of artificialness, unculturedness, and dumb people with an inflated opinion about themselves. One also finds in American responses about Russian culture an empathetic tone, such as in the responses of downtrodden, depression, sad, and scared, which verge on becoming patronizing, such as in the example of reaching to be all they can be. Similar responses that bear an inherent comparative quality and suggest cultural superiority included behind technologically and less order. Such responses naturally beg the question of behind whom and less order than whom, and not only underscore an intransigent us versus them outlook, but suggest that matters of infrastructural sophistication and development define the yardstick by which Americans measure other cultures. An air of arrogance and superiority demonstrated by Americans did not go unnoticed by Russian participants in their responses. with regard to American culture, as evidenced by such characterizations as feeling of superiority, confidence in superiority, desire to be better than all and everything, and striving to be superior. Comparisons of Russian and American cross-cultural perspectives thus suggest that Russian participants certainly do not pander to American cultural norms and ideals as some American participants seem to believe. Ironically, in light of this finding, Russians indicated snobism as a distinguishing characteristic of American culture, a characteristic that remains conspicuously absent in Russian self-perceptions. Responses from Russian and American participants to the question of significant literary figures and personages substantiate an observed worldwide trend away from literature and towards popular culture, as evidenced in part by the high frequency of cinematic figures cited by participants as representing literary figures. Such findings have particular importance in relation to Russian culture, which for decades boasted of having the most avid readers, but which, according to a survey conducted in 2005, currently ranks 7th in the world. Guardians of this literary tradition have expressed concern over an increasingly prevalent role that television and cinema play in shaping public opinion, arguing that television and cinema encourage mediated rather than active engagement, which occurs when reading. Advocates of active engagement assert that ongoing mediated engagement often fosters passive thinking, a condition that can make one particularly vulnerable to manipulation and deception. Just as mediated engagement raises serious concerns relative to identity formation, so too does the trend towards globalization, which de-emphasizes differences in an effort to promote a world community. Yet the economies of Russia and America hardly represent a level economic playing field, for example in terms of exported commodities and franchises, thus confounding the term colonization with its euphemistic partner, globalization. Hence the influx of Western culture, especially American popular culture in Russia over the past decade and a half, heralded under the banner of free market economy and globalization, when in fact, one might argue that Russia has succumbed to Coca-Colanization or McDonaldization. Thus, the current generation of Russian university-age students finds itself at an important cultural juncture made all the more dubious due to once clear cultural boundaries, especially during the Soviet era, that have become blurred. Concurrent with the influx of cultural influences, one observes an alarming disappearance of historical memory, especially in relation to Soviet-era historical figures, explainable in part by participants' efforts to disassociate themselves from undesirable historical periods, capable of impacting negatively on external perceptions of their culture. Naturally, the question arises as to whether a country, or in this case, a rising population of university-age students, can distance itself from the past so rapidly and lose substantial historical memory. Such a course would seem to run counter to Russian perceptions of their own culture as that of historicism, many centuries of history, and cultural monuments. Indeed, Russian participants make only passing reference to suffering inflicted by Stalin, and at that, one could argue that such responses actually bear an element of nostalgia. For example, ability to force all implicitly to obey and strength of spirit. Perhaps, as Motzkin points out, Russian participants prefer to remove the ugly part of history from their identity by claiming that that part of the past happened to someone else. Then again, perhaps with the passing of time, people of all cultures, and creeds for that matter, tend to wax nostalgic and forget and or suppress undesirable aspects of the past while preserving and even distorting favorable aspects. In conclusion, the study of Russian and American cultures represents but one facet of a broad discipline of cross-cultural studies. Such a course of study often prompts introspection and self-scrutiny as one encounters alternative and sometimes opposing views that seem to call into question one's beliefs and values. And yet, such confrontations represent a critical ingredient in life that facilitates inward growth and development. Seeking to understand people and cultures hopefully will characterize us, both individually and collectively, rather than seeking to fix how individuals think and act in other cultures. The former approach lends itself to mutual understanding and sincere appreciation, whereas the latter encourages isolationism and distrust. I began my remarks today with a description of a car race, and will end them with reference to a horse race. Seabiscuit was a magnificent racehorse who captured not only a stunning victory over War Admiral, one of only 11 Triple Crown winners, but who captured the hearts of Americans during the dreary years of the Great Depression. Although his pedigree gave every reason to anticipate greatness, Seabiscuit showed little promise early on. After passing from owner to owner, Charles Howard eventually purchased the horse and set out, with the help of his trainer Tom Smith and jockey Red Pollard, to fix the problems that seemed to prevent Seabiscuit from becoming a great racehorse. Growth and Bentley Seabiscuit became seeking to understand the racer, but as the three men both individually conceded, rather than seeking to fix our horse, he fixed us, and we approach each other. Analogously, process of changing this and that often accompany isolationism in cultures. And yet, individual remarks genuinely description of ourselves to people and including them with reference to a horse race, often discover that in the end, the very culture they once sought to change from without transformed them from within. Thank you. Leon. After owner Charles eventually purchased the